What do blind people experience whilst on hallucinogenic drugs? I once sold mushrooms to a blind guy, had to ask what was up with that. He could see when he was born, but lost his vision before he could remember. When he tripped he could see colors swirling. His brain remembered colors and that was the only way he could see. Edit. Wow guys. My first silver and my first death threat. I really feel like I'm a part of the community now. Thank you kind stranger, for the silver anyway. This comment will probably get buried, but for the few people that do see it, I swear it's true. My good friend was 3 or 4 years old when he was playing near an ice rink and took a slap shot right to the dome. For whatever reason, I'm not a doctor, he was no longer able to see colors at all. Totally grayscale. Now fast forward to college. We had our own houses off campus, so we partied all the time. Smoked a ton of weed, which eventually led to experimenting with LSD. I had done it once or twice before him, but he really wanted to try it, so we invited over maybe half a dozen close friends to chill while we were all tripping. Probably about 2 hours into the trip he looks me in the eyes and says, "Op, your shirt is red. And your eyes are gray." He could see colors again. We were all afraid it would go away when the effects of the LSD wore off, but it's been 5 years and he can still see colors. Granted he has a bit of red blue deficiency but still. Edit. I just talked to him, and apparently he was born grayscale. I don't know why I thought it was a hockey puck but my bad. Edit. One last one, before I get back to work. Instead of commenting on 100 people asking, how did he know what the colors were if he was born grayscale? I'll just say I do not know. I'm an electrician not a brain doctor. I wonder if this experience will differ for those born blind and those who became blind later in life. Good point. People who were born blind never have any development in their visual cortex, whereas people who were blinded in one way or another after the age of 6, I think, would have a fully developed visual cortex and therefore an internal library of visual images. I know this because I read an article on why it would be extremely difficult to make blind people see. Even if we invented an artificial eye, born blind folk literally don't have the brain code to process images, and the struck blind folk all have cortexes that developed visual language unique to them and their vision, so there's no universal base code that would work. Each patient would somehow need to get their brain to correctly read their visual inputed it. Forgot a word. There's a lot more to hallucinogens than just the visual impact. Very a pretty big disconnect from whatever reality it is that you normally experience. A friend told me that it's easier to understand if you had taken hallucinogenics before, but a lot of times hallucinating has little to do with visuals. They are more of an added perk. You'd experience a deeper trip probably, though, since looking at things can be pretty distracting. Yeah, the visuals are such a huge misconception with hallucinogenics psychedelics. You don't literally see crazy shit like a pink elephant in front of you. I'm no expert, but I've done a fair bit of acid and never really see shit except for when I've done acid and math together, and still that's only seeing images within stuff. Like think about a brick wall or something with a lot of detail. You'll see shit made up of all the detail on it, like a face or whatever else might form from it. The most visuals I usually get on acid is stuff like my vision bending or being wobbly and color being more vibrant. But anyway, yeah, visuals are just a little part of it. My friend who tried acid for the first time recently explained it to be something like 10% visuals, 90% body and soul. I'm sure a blind person would trip just as hard if they had acid or any other trip. I'm totally blind and never tried any, but have always wanted to, so as to find out the answer to this very question. I have sight, but once on a very strong mushroom trip a friend and I decided we needed to try to tone down. We shut off the lights and tried to sleep, which is almost impossible on psychedelics, but with the lights off and eyes shut a whole new experience began. The old cabin we were in became louder, even though it was silent, no longer seeing, but hearing the sounds only, echoing, creaking, wind blowing. The sounds could be felt, and most notably tasted. I could feel and taste the creaks of the cabin explode in my mouth like pop rocks. The creaks didn't sound like they were down the hall, but instead right inside my face. This dark eyes closed experience was stronger than any visual. I can only imagine what it would be like for a person with no sight and other heightened and refined senses. My dad is totally blind. He was given codeine by a doctor and it made him hallucinate. He said, instead of walking to the bathroom, I floated there. I was trying to read a braille book, but the dots kept moving around under my fingers and creating nonsense. Yeah, he doesn't take codeine anymore. One of my oldest nearest friends is blind. He went blind when he was 2 during radiation treatment for brain cancer. He just turned 40. He tells me the only time he can visualize things in his mind's eye is when he is on LSD. He says he can see and hear colors in his head. He describes the colors as flashes of kaleidoscopic light. He was also a heavy smoker for many years, but one day he took some liquid acid that presented itself to him at a party. He said he tried to smoke while he was tripping and threw up, and he has never had the urge to smoke again. He literally used LSD once in an extended time period and quit smoking cold turkey, and he has stayed quit for years. Not completely blind here, but I can't see to the left due to a stroke I had sometime probably in my infancy or early childhood. Whenever I take mushrooms I feel my field of vision expand. Now, I know psychs do that by default, because your pupils dilate, but it just feels definitively wider. I don't really know how else to describe it. I'm about 96% blind, so I still a little bit, but done acid LSD about 15-20 times, and DMT once. The DMT was kinda ducked up and not a good time. LSD was funish, but your eyes hurt like duck afterwards. Shrooms were the best by far though. The way he describes it makes me want to try drugs for the first time. Psychedelics aren't really just swirly colors and morphing objects, but so much more. Since you asked what blind people experience, a good way to put this is that explaining a psychedelic experience to someone who doesn't know what it entails is like explaining sight to a blind person. But on top of that, what a person experiences is extremely dependent on how their own thoughts already work as well as their current mood and well-being. But it's akin to those memes poorly made shower thoughts that say that we use only 5% of our brain. Imagine if we used a 100%. It can feel like you are using a 100%. Since the visual aspects is only one aspect of it, it's hard to say what a blind person would experience, but most likely the same sort of expansion of the mind. They might be able to see, hear, feel their own thoughts and patterns. I'd guess hearing and touch might play a larger part, since visual processing normally takes up quite a bit of our brains, but because of brain plasticity these parts might process other things instead. I'm going to guess that sensory overload of other senses might be a thing, but overall they would most likely have a similar experience as other people. Also, considering that what we see already is a hallucinated, interpreted, constructed view of the sensory data we receive through the eyes, it's not totally unreasonable that they be able to see an internal world similar as to dreaming. Only that depending on if they were blind from birth or went blind, that they would have varying levels of visual input to populate this representation with. Once I gave my blind friend some brownie. I told him to go easy on them. He had made the mistake that most noobers do first time eating edibles. I forgot to ask how his experience was, but he told me he had a hell of a trip, mostly napping lol. I have aphantasia, meaning I'm part of the 1-2% with a blind mind's eye. I can't visualize things at all. I can't picture my wife or baby. I can tell you what they look like, but it's like reading a text file about an image. I can dream, but it's totally non-visual. It's more of a collection of plot points. I used to describe my dreams as being like reading paragraphs of a book until someone pointed out that when reading a book, most people are picturing something. I've only really done one decent batch of hallucinogens, magic mushrooms, about 12 years ago, long before I knew I was an aphantasiac. Only found that out 4 months ago. I remember being blown away by the experience. I could picture things. I could close my eyes and think of something, and it was there, visible. It was incredible. In hindsight, I presume my trip sounded pretty lame when I described it afterwards to any normal person. I'm into my 30s and a boring dad now, but since making the connection between aphantasia and mushrooms, I'm keen to try LSD or DMT if I can source them to see what the effect is like. If I could close my eyes and imagine my wife and daughter, I'd probably cry. Late to the party and I can't answer this, but can add given enough LSD you will hear auditory hallucinations, if you will. I have been at the party and the music just dropped right out, to be replaced with an almost submarine ping ascending and descending. Nothing else. Grantedly I was obviously high as a ducking kite at the time. It was a great night and a pretty interesting experience. I knew a man. When I was a kid, I was told he had been born blind. When he was little, he suffered of some child sickness that caused very high fevers, and he told his parents he had felt things around him like he had never experienced before. His father was a drunkard, but nonetheless a phenomenal painter, and taught him to paint using a grid over a canvas, and using pressure to measure how much ink he put on the canvas. I saw some of the paintings he drew. Yes, you can say it was my childish imagination and primate brain assigning meaning to blots of ink. He only used black, but most of his paintings were uncannily visually striking, resembling landscapes. He also tried to paint faces of people he touched and objects. He picked up his father's alcohol abuse and added drug use to it, and his paintings under the influence reflected what he saw in his mind. That made me postulate that perhaps we have some degree of genetic memory, a bank filled with primitive imagery, and that our brain has more capabilities than what we suspect. I've had pretty strong visual hallucinations with a high enough dosage, but they are generally not the highlight of the trip for me. I've been properly ducked up without strong visual hallucinations as well. My friends who have done too much in one sitting told me they were on the verge of blacking out anyway. The main cause is the altered state of mind, and the intense feelings, thoughts that seem like they are trying to burst out. All your other senses are warped too, so what you hear, taste, and even feel will seem off, so even when you're blind, you'll definitely know you're on hallucinogens. I'm legally blind. I have retinitis pigmentosa, which causes tunnel vision. I have about 10 degrees of sight, and also my retinas are decaying, so they don't let light in the dark or low light. So not completely blind. But when I've taken shrooms and acid, I internalize quite a lot, and my extremely narrow field of view becomes very noticeable. I find it quite overwhelming at times, because I don't know what's happening around me, and if I'm with other people, it can be quite confusing when someone all of a sudden appears in my limited peripherals. I have a family member who went totally lights out blind at 70 or so. He is an amazing dude, and still lives alone. Almost totally self-sufficient at 85. One time about 5 years ago he mixed up his meds, or some jackhole thought it would be a hoot, to dose an elderly blind man, and some kind of interaction caused visual hallucinations. He believed his apartment was a church that was under attack, and he barricaded his doors and windows with his furniture. When he was at the hospital he said he could see a little fat girl sitting at the foot of his bed, or on a chair, and he talked with her for some time, until his metabolism caught up with him. When he was hallucinating he said he could fully see the rooms he was. I imagine that with a lack of real visual input he was basically able to visualize his mental map of his surroundings. He had previously been sighted, so I know his experience would also be very different from someone who had always been blind. TL. Dr. Elderly blind relative went rolling, defended a church, told his life story to a chubby little ghost. My dad is blind since age 4, he's 66 now. He described being on acid to me one night while we are talking. He said outside of deep thought his sense of touch or feel was affected. He said that he was standing on a hill on a windy and said that it felt like the wind was passing through him. Also figured how to get better at creative while high as duck after climbing a tree to smoke some hash. Hallucinogenic drugs aren't just visual. In fact, the most surprising thing when tripping for the first time is how the visuals are pretty much the least memorable part. Tripping affects every sense and the way you think. Your brain constantly goes on tangents, and it feels like you have about 50 thoughts at once. I'm almost, not entirely blind. I've done mushrooms, weed and acid in my teen years. With hallucinating, there's a lot of disassociation from yourself and the world around you. Especially if you have to feel to get around. The textures you'd entirely expect become surprising. And of course, since I can see sometimes and know what things look like structurally, I have more backquote imagination than hallucinations, because it all comes from an idea stemmed in my mind. I wonder what a lamp would look like cut into little cubes. And I hallucinate it. I probably would have an answer to this if I hadn't blacked out the 2 times I did 8 ball. Apparently I seemed like a competent lunatic that had a ton of crazy ideas. I also caused over $20,000 in damage to city property. Henceforth, I'm probably not the best source.